Private investigator Jane Harper was known for her sharp mind and unrelenting pursuit of the truth. She was often employed by wealthy and eccentric individuals to solve mysteries with utmost discretion. One rainy evening, she was called to investigate a curious case at the old Thornwood Manor, a mansion on the outskirts of town owned by one of the town's oldest families. The house's caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Wallace, had reported the sudden disappearance of a valuable family heirloom, a jeweled brooch worth a small fortune. When Jane arrived, she was greeted by the anxious Mr. Wallace, who led her to the grand drawing room where the family's historical heirlooms were proudly displayed. It was stored in a glass case, now empty, with no obvious signs of forced entry. The room was immaculate, save for a single muddy footprint on the polished wooden floor. "That footprint wasn't there this morning," Mr. Wallace said, wringing his hands. "It's as if someone just appeared out of thin air. We've been robbed." Jane knelt down to examine the footprint. It was on the smaller side. She scanned the room, her eyes narrowing as she noticed something odd. The curtains by the window were slightly askew, and a faint smudge of dirt marred the sill. "Did anyone else have access to this room?" Jane asked. "Only Mrs. Collins, the housekeeper," Mr. Wallace replied. "But she's been with the family for years. She wouldn't." Jane interrupted him. "Where is Mrs. Collins now?" "She's in her room, said she wasn't feeling well," Mr. Wallace answered, frowning. Jane's mind raced. She had a hunch, but needed more evidence. She asked Mr. Wallace to fetch Mrs. Collins immediately. When the housekeeper arrived, Jane observed her closely. Mrs. Collins seemed calm, but there was a faint trace of mud on the hem of her skirt. "Mrs. Collins," Jane began, "I believe you've been hiding something." The woman's composure faltered. I don't know what you mean," she stammered. "I would like you both to follow me outside." Bewildered, Wallace and Mrs. Collins followed Jane out into the rain, to the window of the drawing room. On a small nail protruding from the windowsill was a tiny, torn piece of fabric. It matched Mrs. Collins' dress perfectly. "The brooch wasn't stolen by an intruder. You crept in through the window to make it look like a burglary, but you left behind evidence." Mrs. Collins' face turned pale, and she sank into a chair, knowing she'd been caught. Jane had solved the mystery, proving once again that even the smallest clue can unravel the most carefully laid plans.